Hey there, my name's Curtis Lucas and you're watching Empire Building. So in this episode, we're going to be talking again about Marathon's record-breaking Bitcoin miner purchase from Bitmain. Details were disclosed yesterday in an SEC filing that Marathon actually spent over $879 million on Bitcoin miners from Bitmain. Now that is a huge chunk of change, so we're going to talk about this and answer some of the questions I've been seeing floating around Twitter about this. Many people believing that they should have just used that money and bought Bitcoin with. So we're going to look at whether or not that actually makes sense and is this a good deal or not. And as always, I've dug a little bit deeper into this, so you're going to find some information in this video that you're just not going to see anywhere else. So earlier today, Bitcoin Magazine published the article disclosing what Marathon purchased for these miners. As I mentioned, the SEC filing was submitted or disclosed yesterday. But in the article, they do get into most of the details that this cost about $879 million, actually $879,060,000 to be exact. I did the math. This is for 78,000 miners, the new Antminer S19 XP model, which I talked a little bit about in the last video where I first discussed this purchase. Those are the new state-of-the-art Antminer Bitcoin miners producing 140 terahash per second while consuming slightly less power than the S19J Pro model. So it's looking at more than a 40% increase in efficiency here. But the cost per miner works out to be exactly $11,270 per miner. That is a nice chunk of change. That equates to a total cost of $80.50 per terahash in US dollars. On Twitter, when this announcement was first made, Blonity over at Think Like a Whale, if anybody's not watching his channel, I highly recommend it. A lot of great content on miners over there, but his prediction was that he expected they probably spent about $70 per terahash. So he was actually pretty close. I was impressed by that prediction. I wasn't sure how high this would end up going, but $80 a terahash is quite a bit of money to be spending. But again, the question of whether or not it's too much money, that we're going to get into. And as it turns out, Riot Blockchain announced earlier this month that they had gone into a purchase agreement with Bitmain for the exact same S19 XP miners. And their purchase price per unit worked out to actually exactly $11,000 each. So a $270 discount over what Mara paid for them, given the fact that Mara purchased a whole lot more quantity. They still paid more per miner than Riot did. But this is a pretty clear indication of the direction of those costs as time goes on. Guaranteed, the next company to make an announcement of the purchase of these miners will no doubt pay more than Riot or Mara. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The trend on the cost of these miners is only headed in one direction, and there's not a whole lot of options if you're looking for the state-of-the-art and the highest efficiencies. Otherwise, your only options are to scrape up whatever you can get on the secondary market or the used market. But when you're building for the future and you're just looking to be in the cutting edge, then it's a competitive market, and these companies are driven to the leader in the space, and that's Bitmain. So as far as comparisons go, it's pretty clear they did not overpay for this order. And the reality is now everyone else that wants to buy it is going to have to get in line behind Marathon or pay even more. Now, it's possible that Marathon might have been able to pay slightly less if they were willing to take a longer term schedule, but as we know, Marathon has very aggressive plans for their build out, and they want to be able to accept deliveries of all these miners by the end of 2022. In fact, this article does go into further detail of that which was disclosed in the filing, that they're going to be receiving 13,000 miners per month from Bitmain between July and December. Every single month, they will receive another 13,000 miners. Again, the math on this, that works out to, at 140 terahash per miner, 1.82 exahash in growth of hash rate per month, every single month for the second half of the year. The growth in the first half of the year is going to be even greater than that. So it's going to be a thrill to watch Marathon and its growth over the coming year in 2022. But we can't stop there, because there is more to look at here. When we compare the cost per terahash with the previous orders that these companies have made, going back to Riot's last major purchase of 42,000 of the S19J Pro models, they spent $3,297 per miner, which works out to $32.97 per terahash. Now that is considerably less. In fact, that's less than half of what Marathon just paid for these miners. But again, that particular order was made back in April of this year. A lot has changed since then. The space has expanded, and the demand for these miners is skyrocketing and continuing in that direction. At this point, Bitcoin miners are even more scarce than Bitcoin itself. So the next fair question is, how long does it take to pay off a miner like this? A miner that costs over $11,000 to purchase. And why wouldn't they just take all that money and buy Bitcoin instead with it? I mean, had they purchased Bitcoin instead with all of that money, they could have acquired at a current price of approximately $47,000, 18,703 Bitcoin. That would be a massive increase to their current holdings. So we're going to have a look at that question now. This is a very useful calculator on the website whattomine.com. And I've already inputted all the parameters for this miner based on all the cost information to do with Marathon's mining operations. So I've adjusted the hash rate to 140 terahash to represent one of these miners, the power it consumes at 3,010 watts, and the cost of electricity of 4.4 cents per kilowatt hour, which comes directly from Marathon's latest SEC filing, where they outline the service agreement between them and Compute North. Now, very quickly, we currently do not know where these miners are going to be hosted. I'll get into that in a second, but I'm going to assume that whatever service agreement they do eventually get into place will be fairly similar to this, what they currently have in place with Compute North. And the cost of the hardware at $11,270, which we've just learned. With all of those parameters, this calculator determines that these miners will break even in 362.89 days. So approximately 1 year. After 1 year, the cost of those miners has been completely recovered by the Bitcoin that it mined. So everything after that is pure profit. And at this point, it's pretty widely known that these miners will remain profitable for at least 5 years. I think it'll actually take longer than that. In fact, the S9s that were originally released over 5 years ago are still profitable today. And the change in efficiencies of Bitcoin miners over the last 5 years is far greater than it's going to be over the next 5 years. And this is why I believe that the miners that they're purchasing today are definitely going to last and remain profitable longer than 5 years. And the other fact that we have to consider is this is based on today's market conditions. Should Bitcoin's price over the next year rise faster than its hash rate, then the break-even time will be cut even more. These things could break even within 6 months. Not to mention, they're not even going to be taking delivery of these things for another 6 months. So by that time, the break-even price could already be 6 months. And this is what I mean. When running a mining company of this scale, you do have to be thinking many months and even years into the future. Buying Bitcoin is great, but then what? You're done. If Bitcoin appreciates or doubles in price, okay, great. You've doubled your initial investment. But then what? This is a Bitcoin miner. Its entire purpose of its entire business model is to mine Bitcoin, not buy Bitcoin. That's MicroStrategy. We already got one of those. It may take a little longer to acquire that Bitcoin onto the balance sheet, but they'd be doing it at a hugely, massively discounted rate. Their current cost to mine a Bitcoin is somewhere around $5,000 to $6,000. So the bottom line is, over the life of these miners, they will be able to acquire far more than the equivalent amount of Bitcoin that they would be able to purchase if they just invested in Bitcoin today. That's the bottom line. And that's why we invest in miners. That's a big part of the value proposition. And the fact that Bitcoin miners are increasing in price only serves as an indicator that there's more and more demand moving into this market. More and more demand to build out all that infrastructure. And the other thing to keep in mind is efficiency costs. The fact that they're paying more money to get more hash rate into the same size box is important, because if you have to instead purchase 3 miners to accomplish what 2 miners now can, then you've just saved 33% in real estate. Remember that they operate on a massive scale. All of these miners take up physical space. And if you can occupy 33% less space to accomplish the same output, there's a cost associated with that as well. That means buildings can be 33% smaller or contain 33% more miners, which are also more efficient than the previous ones. Everything adds up, and it is a race to the top. But some people might actually find it irresponsible to be spending this kind of money on miners when they don't actually have a home for them currently. Well,
sometimes you gotta run before you can walk.
This is the exact same thing they did last year when they announced the original purchase of those 70,000 miners that they've been deploying throughout this year. They move aggressively on these long-term lead time deliveries, and then in tandem work to catch up on everything else that needs to be put in place. Is it a risk? Sure, there's always risk. But so far, they have demonstrated an ability to execute and plan accordingly so that they can meet those deliveries with a place, a home for them. So I have no doubt that they will execute on that again. But it's true that the miners are only one half of the equation, so it's going to be very important that they move quickly to secure the real estate required to house these miners, as well as the power that's needed to run them. So I hope that explanation was sufficient. I did my best to communicate these topics. I know that they're complicated, but the more and more you get into this, the easier it does become to develop that level of understanding. As you can see, this space is changing quickly. The parameters change along with it. So evaluating these things doesn't get any easier as time goes on, because you have to keep evaluating it in turn with what the market is doing. Hash rate is getting more expensive, but this also plays in to that reality that the demand and the chip shortage and how all that impacts the existing large market players. There is a first mover advantage. There is a moat. Now, that moat does need to be defended, and that's where purchases like this come into play. Anybody else that wants to compete on that level now has to be able to pony up $1 billion just to obtain half the hash rate that Marathon's going to have by the end of next year. I look forward to talking more about this with Fred Thiel, who I'm happy to announce has accepted my invitation to be on the channel. We're going to interview him next week. So I look forward to bringing that to all of you. There's obviously, with all of these developments, there's a ton to talk about. So I'm very, very excited to be able to bring that to you. So stay tuned. But for now, let's get back to empire building.